Of all the bizarre things that have happened in New York, this is hands down top of the list. Because what do you mean there was an 8-day war over a hat? There has to be more than that, right? Well, believe it or not, one of the most important fashion accessories in the 1920s was the hat, so much so that there was an 8-day war over it. In September 1922, the streets of New York City became a battlefield, not over politics or territory, but over a simple article of clothing. Imagine a man walking through Manhattan, minding his own business, when he is suddenly surrounded by a mob of youths. They aren't after his money, they're after his hat. His crime was defying a strict, unwritten rule of fashion. You did not wear a straw hat after September 15th. This date was the unofficial point when summer attire, like the straw boater hat, was to be packed away in favor of autumn's felt hats. For several days, the city erupted in chaos over this fashion faux pas. What started as a tradition of friends playfully smashing each other's hats on the stock market floor escalated into citywide violence. Gangs of young men and teenagers, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, roamed the streets looking for violators. Armed with sticks, some even with nails driven through the ends to better snag their targets, they would snatch straw hats from the heads of unsuspecting pedestrians and stomp them into ruin. This was no harmless prank. When the wearers resisted, brawls broke out. The initial conflict started on September 13th, 2 days before the deadline, when youths targeted factory workers and dock workers, leading to a fight so large it stopped traffic on the Manhattan Bridge. The ensuing riots led to numerous arrests and serious injuries. Several men were hospitalized after being beaten for defending their right to wear a hat of their choice. For 8 days, New York City was in the grip of a conflict sparked entirely by a hat. To comprehend the chaos of the straw hat riot, one must first appreciate the profound significance of a man's hat in the 1920s. It was far more than a simple accessory. It was an extension of his identity, a marker of his social standing, and a rigid indicator of the season. The rules governing headwear were numerous, complex, and taken with the utmost seriousness. A man and his hat were considered inseparable from the moment he left his home until he returned at night. How he handled his hat in public spoke volumes about his character and upbringing. The columnist Helen Rowland, writing in September 1922, captured the sentiment perfectly. The average man's devotion to his hat is one of life's greatest mysteries. It seems to be something sacred in his life, which he cherishes and protects as passionately as he does his dignity, his honor, and his grandmother's memory. She noted that a man would fight for his hat, quarrel over it, and risk his life to save it from the wind. For boys, snatching another's hat was a direct invitation to a fight. The formal code of conduct was so intricate that Emily Post's 1922 guide to etiquette dedicated 4 full pages to the subject. A gentleman was expected to wear his hat when outdoors, at sporting events, on public transportation, and inside the lobbies of hotels and offices. Conversely, he was required to remove it upon entering a private home, a church, a theater, a school, or a courthouse. It was taken off when eating, when greeting someone, and certainly when the national anthem was played or the American flag passed in a parade. A slight lift of the hat from the forehead, known as doffing, was a necessary gesture of respect toward a lady or a person of importance. Hat advertisements of the era even posed the question, how could you doff your hat to a lady if you didn't wear one? Beyond these daily customs was an even more inflexible rule, the seasonal hat calendar. A specific type of hat was mandated for specific times of the year. The lightweight, comfortable straw boater hat, originally worn for summer sports, had become acceptable warm-weather attire even for city businessmen. The season for straw hats officially began on May 15th, a date known as Straw Hat Day. However, there was a strict and socially enforced deadline for putting them away. That date was September 15th, known colloquially as Felt Hat Day, when all men were expected to switch to heavier felt or silk hats for the autumn and winter months. While the date was arbitrary, it was a powerful social convention. The rule was so ingrained in the culture that newspapers would publish articles in the days leading up to September 15th, warning men that the time to change their headwear was approaching. To wear a straw hat after the cutoff was to commit a serious fashion faux pas. At best, the offender would face public mockery and ridicule. At worst, he would become a target. A peculiar tradition had emerged where young men and boys would forcibly knock the out-of-season straw hats from wearers' heads and stomp them into destruction on the pavement. This practice, it seems, originated in a playful manner among stockbrokers on the floor of the stock exchange, who could afford to destroy a friend's hat. Beyond these daily customs was an even more inflexible rule: the seasonal hat calendar. A specific type of hat was mandated for specific times of the year. The lightweight, comfortable straw boater hat, originally worn for summer sports, had become acceptable warm-weather attire even for city businessmen. The season for straw hats officially began on May 15th, a date known as Straw Hat Day. However, there was a strict and socially enforced deadline for putting them away. That date was September 15th, known colloquially as Felt Hat Day, when all men were expected to switch to heavier. The simmering tension over seasonal headwear finally boiled over on September 13th, 1922, 2 days before the socially mandated deadline for retiring straw hats. The flashpoint was the gritty, notorious neighborhood of Mulberry Bend in Manhattan. At the time, Mulberry Bend was known as one of the city's roughest areas, a crowded enclave of tenements seen by many as a world of crime, poverty, and immigrant life, a place where street gangs like the Dead Rabbits and the Bowery Boys had once held sway. It was a neighborhood with its own codes and a population that understood hardship and confrontation. Into a setting like this, a group of impatient youths decided to get an early start on the hat-smashing tradition, viewing the local workers as easy marks for their prank. Their rampage began with the men who toiled in the local factories. These workers, likely caught off guard as they left for the day, were the first to have their straw hats snatched from their heads and unceremoniously stomped into the ground. Initially, the attacks were met with little more than surprised insults, and the youths grew bolder with each successful conquest. They saw themselves as enforcers of a fashion rule, but their actions were pure hooliganism, a show of youthful dominance in a part of the city where such displays were common. Their confidence surging, the gang of hat smashers soon turned their attention to a new group of targets, a decision that would prove to be a grave miscalculation. The youths next set their sights on a group of dock workers. These were not men who would be easily intimidated. Hardened by grueling labor on the waterfront, the dockers were, as sources from the period noted, made of sterner stuff. When the teenagers attempted their hat-snatching routine on them, they were met not with surprise, but with fierce and immediate resistance. The dock workers refused to tolerate the disrespect and fought back with a vengeance. The one-sided assaults instantly transformed into a genuine street brawl. What had been a cruel prank became a pitched battle. The altercation exploded in scale and ferocity. Fists flew, and the clash between the young hoodlums and the powerful dock workers spilled out from the narrow streets. The fight grew so large and chaotic that it surged onto the approach of the Manhattan Bridge, bringing the flow of wagons, automobiles, and pedestrians to a complete standstill. The melee effectively choked off a major artery of the city, turning a fashion dispute into a public menace. The sight of dozens of men brawling over hats was enough to halt commerce and daily life, signaling that this was no longer a trivial matter. The police were forced to intervene, wading into the fray to break up the combatants and make several arrests, hauling the first offenders of the nascent hat war away. But the spark had been lit. The fight at Mulberry Bend was only the beginning of the chaos. The initial brawl at Mulberry Bend was merely a prelude to the pandemonium that would consume New York City. The violence of September 13th was a tremor, but the following evening, the earthquake hit. The conflict metastasized, spreading from the Lower East Side and engulfing vast swathes of Manhattan in a wave of anarchic glee. The city's avenues transformed into war zones where the enemy was any man audacious enough to wear a straw hat. This was not a spontaneous uprising. It was an organized campaign of terror waged by roving gangs of teenagers. For nights, these young hoodlums prowled the streets, their numbers swelling from small groups into formidable mobs. One witness, a promoter named E.C. Jones, reported seeing a mass of about 1,000 youths swarming Amsterdam Avenue, creating a terrifying gauntlet for any man wearing the offending headwear. Complaints flooded police stations from across the city as men reported being ambushed and having their hats stolen and destroyed. The gangs operated with impunity, melting away when police arrived in one district only to reform and resume their attacks elsewhere. The rioters came armed. Their weapon of choice was a long stick, made more menacing by a nail hammered through the tip. This crude but effective tool was perfect for hooking a straw boater from an unsuspecting victim's head. Some boys amassed grim trophies, collecting dozens of vanquished hats and jamming them onto their sticks. This was more than a prank. It was a hunt. The New York Times reported that youths would hide in doorways, leaping out to unhat passersby before they knew what was happening. In other instances, they lined the streetcar tracks, forming a corridor of tormentors who would snatch hats directly from the heads of passengers as the cars rolled past. The chaos on Amsterdam Avenue was particularly intense. The street was reportedly dotted with the crushed remains of straw hats, the casualties of the one-sided fashion war. The violence was personal and brutal. Men who dared to resist were not just mocked. They were viciously beaten. The New York Tribune described the citywide rampage as a straw hat smashing orgy, driven by boys guided less by the weather and more by their own troublemaking proclivities. Even the authorities were not immune. The police, who were slow to respond and greatly outnumbered, found themselves caught in the mayhem. In one incident, a group of boys brazenly knocked the hat from acting Detective Sergeant Brindisi's head and threw it into the street. As the detective gave chase, he was tripped and fell into a gutter, a moment of slapstick humiliation that showed just how little fear the rioters had for the law. As the anarchy spread, hat stores discovered an unexpected business opportunity, staying open late to sell felt hats to the newly bareheaded men desperate to avoid another attack. Within the citywide chaos, the Great Straw Hat Riot was not just an abstract event of mob violence. It was a collection of deeply personal and often brutal encounters. The statistics of arrests and the descriptions of roving gangs only tell part of the story. The true impact is found in the experiences of the individuals who were caught in the crossfire, turning a bizarre fashion dispute into a terrifying ordeal. For these men, the fight was no longer about a simple hat, but about personal dignity and safety in the face of a frenzied mob. One such victim was a man named Harry Gerber. He was not a passive recipient of the mob's judgment. When a crowd of youths descended upon him with the intent of destroying his straw hat, Gerber fought back. He refused to surrender his property or his right to wear it. His resistance, however, was met with overwhelming force, and the ensuing beating was so severe that he was left hospitalized. Gerber's story illustrates the grim reality of the riots. Defending a simple piece of headwear could lead to serious physical harm. His stand was a testament to the principle that a man's hat was, as one columnist put it, something he would cherish and protect as passionately as his own honor. The violence was not limited to those who directly participated. Innocent bystanders were also swept up in the pandemonium. 10-year-old John Sweeney was merely watching the sport of hat smashing on 7th Avenue when he was struck by an automobile, his leg broken in the confusion. His injury highlights the indiscriminate nature of the chaos, where even a child spectator could become a casualty of the mob's reckless activity. The streets had become genuinely dangerous, and the rioters' actions had consequences that extended far beyond their intended targets. The perpetrators of the violence, mostly teenagers and young men, saw themselves not as criminals, but as enforcers of tradition. They were the self-appointed guardians of a social code, and they acted with a startling degree of organization and cruelty. They armed themselves with sticks, often with nails driven through the ends, to create crude hooks for snagging hats off the heads of their victims. They would lie in wait in doorways or swarm streetcars, creating gauntlets of terror for anyone wearing a straw boater. Their sense of impunity was so strong that they even targeted off-duty police officers. Acting Detective Sergeant Brindisi had his hat snatched, and when he gave chase, the youths tripped him, causing him to fall into a gutter. The aftermath for these young rioters varied. While many were arrested, their youth often saved them from serious punishment. Some were fined, and a few received short jail sentences. In a particularly telling episode, Several boys who were arrested were taken to the local police station, where their parents were summoned. Upon learning of their son's actions, the parents administered spankings right there in the station, a strange and public conclusion to their part in the citywide mayhem. As the city plunged into chaos, the official response from law enforcement and the judiciary struggled to catch up. Initially, the New York City police seemed to view the hat smashing as a trivial matter, a seasonal outburst of youthful mischief rather than a serious threat to public order. Officers at stations like the one on East 104th Street were reportedly dismissive of the numerous complaints flooding their desks, at least until the rioters made the conflict personal. The police department's attitude shifted dramatically when patrolmen and even plainclothes detectives found themselves becoming targets, their own uniform caps and personal hats knocked from their heads and trampled by the brazen mobs. The burden of dealing with the arrested rioters fell to the city's courts, and in a twist of fate that seems almost fictional, the magistrate presiding over many of the cases was a man named Peter A. Hatting. As the youths were hauled into his courtroom, Magistrate Hatting became the primary figure attempting to restore order through legal decree. Faced with a parade of offenders, he delivered a stern and widely reported warning. In a declaration that championed individual liberty over mob rule, Hatting proclaimed, "It is against the law to smash a man's hat, and he has a right to wear it in a January snowstorm if he wishes." He made it clear that to hit a man's hat is a simple assault, and in this court it will be treated as such. The punishments Hatting and other officials meted out were varied. For the first 7 men brought before him for their part in a hat-smashing saturnalia, Magistrate Hatting imposed a fine of $5 each. However, he issued a stern warning that subsequent offenders would not get off so lightly, promising that the next men brought before him for the same crime would go to jail. While most who were found guilty opted to pay the fine, at least one man, identified as A. Silverman, was sentenced to 3 days in jail, the longest sentence recorded during the riots. The age of many participants presented a unique challenge for the authorities. A significant number of the rioters were teenagers, some as young as 10 years old, which meant they fell under the legal category of juvenile delinquency. This limited the court's options for punishment. In some precincts, police lieutenants improvised a more archaic form of justice. Instead of formal charges, they summoned the parents of arrested boys to the station. There, in an act of public humiliation, fathers were instructed to spank their misbehaving sons in front of the police, an order many complied with on the spot. This unusual tactic was a desperate attempt to quell the youth-driven chaos that the formal legal system was struggling to contain. On the surface, the Great Straw Hat Riot appears to be a bizarre and almost comical episode, a citywide brawl over a fashion choice. A deeper examination, however, reveals that the violence was not really about the hats at all. Instead, it was a volatile expression of the deep-seated social anxieties and cultural battles that defined the Roaring Twenties. The straw hat was merely the fuse that ignited a powder keg of simmering tensions related to class, tradition, and a rapidly changing social order. The 1920s were a decade of profound cultural conflict, a period when the nation was sharply divided. American society was caught in a tug-of-war between traditional values, often rooted in rural life, and an emerging, fast-paced modernism centered in the cities. Issues of immigration, race, and morality were creating deep fissures in the national identity. The riot was a microcosm of this larger struggle. The youths who took to the streets saw themselves as defenders of tradition, righteous enforcers of an established, unwritten law. To them, a man wearing a straw hat past September 15th wasn't just making a fashion mistake. He was defying the accepted social structure, and that defiance required a punitive response. Their actions were a raw and violent assertion of power, an attempt to impose order in a world they felt was spinning out of control. Class conflict was a significant undercurrent fueling the flames. The straw boater hat, while worn by many, was often associated with the middle and upper classes, men who worked in offices or enjoyed summer leisure. The rioters, on the other hand, were predominantly young, working-class men and boys. Their rampage can be interpreted as a symbolic assault on a class they perceived as privileged. By destroying the hats, they were, in a way, attacking a symbol of the social elites, venting frustrations that were likely rooted in economic inequality and a sense of alienation. This reflects a broader sentiment of the era, where groups like the Ku Klux Klan, which saw a revival in the 1920s, expressed antipathy towards Wall Street and big business, showcasing a widespread distrust of the financial elite. Furthermore, the riots cannot be separated from the context of youth gang culture in early 20th century American cities. New York was a city where youth gangs were a fixture of urban life, particularly in working-class and immigrant neighborhoods. These groups were often born from conditions of poverty and social disorganization, and they operated by their own codes of honor and masculinity. For these established gangs, the hat-smashing tradition provided the perfect pretext for the kind of collective violence and territorial assertion that was already central to their existence. The riot gave them a socially acceptable reason to engage in the mayhem that was part of their subculture. The conflict was less about fashion etiquette and more about the thrill of the chase and the assertion of dominance on the streets they considered their own. The 8-day war over fashion could not last forever. After a week of chaos, the Great Straw Hat Riot of 1922 finally began to lose its ferocious momentum. The city's return to a semblance of normalcy was not due to a single event, but rather a combination of exhaustion, authority, and the simple passing of time. The New York Police Department, after being caught flat-footed and even targeted by the mobs, eventually cracked down with more organized force. Magistrate Hadding's stern warnings and consistent fines in night court made it clear that there would be legal consequences for what some considered a youthful prank. As the calendar moved further past the September 15th deadline, the original justification for the violence, however flimsy, evaporated completely. The streets, once littered with the broken remains of straw boaters, were gradually cleared, and the city breathed a collective sigh of relief as the dust settled. However, the ghost of the riot lingered. The tradition of hat-smashing did not die with the end of the 1922 mayhem. While the scale of the violence was never again so widespread, the custom continued as a dangerous undercurrent in the city's life. This simmering aggression led to a truly tragic conclusion 2 years later. In 1924, would have been a story of brawls and beatings turned deadly. During another outbreak of hat-smashing violence, a man was murdered for the crime of wearing a straw hat out of season. This shocking escalation revealed just how deeply the violent enforcement of this social norm had taken root. The death transformed the tradition from a bizarre social quirk into a legitimate public menace. The final death blow to the unwritten law came not from the police or the courts, but from the highest office in the land. In 1925, President Calvin Coolidge, a man known for his quiet and reserved demeanor, made a powerful and public statement without saying a word. He was photographed openly wearing his straw hat well past the September 15th cutoff date. The act was a deliberate and direct defiance of the mob-enforced rule. Newspapers like the New York Times ran stories on the president's sartorial choice, effectively giving national permission to ignore the outdated custom. If the President of the United States could wear a straw hat whenever he pleased, the authority of teenage street gangs to enforce a fashion calendar was rendered meaningless. Coolidge's simple act of personal liberty did more to end the tradition than all the arrests and court rulings combined. The era of the Straw Hat War was over, killed by a presidential fashion statement and the sobering reality of a man who paid the ultimate price for his choice of headwear. The Great Straw Hat Riot of 1922 stands as one of the most peculiar episodes in American history, a moment when a simple article of clothing ignited a citywide conflict. The story of mobs of young men rampaging through New York City to violently enforce a fashion deadline seems, from a modern perspective, almost unbelievable. Yet, for 8 days, the streets were a battleground where the straw boater hat was a symbol of social defiance, and its destruction became a brutal public ritual. The events force us to look past the absurdity and consider the deeper lessons this fashion faux pas can teach us about society, conformity, and the dark side of tradition. At its core, the riot was a story about the immense power of unwritten rules. In the 1920s, a time of great social flux and tension between old traditions and new modernist ideas, societal norms were a powerful force for order. The rioters, mostly working-class youths, saw themselves not as hooligans, but as guardians of tradition. They believed that anyone who defied such a well-established cultural expectation, no matter how frivolous it seemed, deserved to be punished. Their violence was an assertion of power, a way to police behavior and enforce a sense of social order in a world that was rapidly changing. The men who dared to wear straw hats past September 15th were seen as a threat to these norms, and their actions were met with a violent response meant to maintain the status quo. Looking back, we can see that the conflict was never truly about the hats themselves. It was a physical manifestation of the anxieties of an era. The straw boater was associated with a certain level of class and leisure, and for the young rioters, attacking the hat may have been a way to symbolically lash out at a social structure from which they felt alienated. The violence provided a socially acceptable outlet for youthful aggression and gang mentality, all under the guise of upholding a community standard. The fact that the chaos could be triggered so easily reveals the fragile line between social convention and mob rule. The legacy of the Straw Hat Riot is a potent reminder of how quickly a seemingly harmless tradition can escalate into something dangerous and even deadly. What began as a playful custom among stockbrokers devolved into citywide assaults, leading to serious injuries and, 2 years later, a man's death. The riots exposed the absurdity and the inherent danger of violently enforcing arbitrary social codes. Ultimately, the tradition faded away not because of police action, but because of cultural shifts, President Coolidge's quiet defiance, and, more permanently, the simple fact that the straw boater hat went out of style. What do you think? Was this a justified war? Would you be in support of such a war if it broke out today?